Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those who joined us from across the world. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes. In the meantime, that others can join in. Let's just wait for another couple of minutes so that we don't want anybody to miss this insightful session that we have for all of you today. I'm sure our team is very excited to present you some insightful session to all the supply chain leaders that we have from across the world. I can see already people joining in. Sorry to keep you waiting. We're just starting in a few minutes. We don't want anybody to miss out on the insights that we have for all of you. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those who joined us from across the world. I'm your host, Anish Krishnan, Head of Marketing at QKS Group. And today's session is all for supply chain leaders. When visibility isn't enough, the supply chain officer's challenge of operations to control. To dig deep, we have our experts on the subject. I welcome Sanjeevi, Executive Vice President at QKS Group. Along with him, we have Kumar Anand, Associate Director Research. Both of them will take us through understanding supply chain visibility challenges, a transition to operational control and limitations, and of course, some actionable insights for all the supply chain leaders. With that, once again, I thank you all for joining us. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the Q&A session below, and then we'll surely answer those questions towards the end of the session. With that, I hand it over to Sanjeevi and Kumar.
Thank you, Anish, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The title of this session is quite deliberate. So, over the last decade, supply chain transformation has largely revolved around one big idea: visibility. Organizations invested heavily in control towers, event monitoring systems, and analytics platforms with a simple belief: if we can see more, we can respond better. And to be fair to this thought process, that investment has delivered value. And most large enterprises today have real-time shipment tracking, network-wide inventory views, and predictive alerts that simply did not exist before. On a lighter note, the real-time shipment tracking is so strong that in some cases, we even know that a shipment is late even before the carrier does. But here is the catch. While visibility has improved significantly, operational outcomes have not caught up. They have not improved at the same pace, and disruptions still escalate into service failures. Response times still vary widely from one team or region to another, and many decisions today still depend on manual coordination across, say, planning, logistics, procurement, and customer service. In other words, we can see the problem faster, but we don't always resolve it faster. I mean, that is the situation we are in today. When we speak with chief supply chain officers and supply chain leaders today, the conversation is actually shifting. They are not asking for more dashboards. They are asking for systems that helps them and that helps their teams act faster, act more consistently, and reduce the firefighting. Visibility tells us what is happening, and control determines what happens next. And today, in many organizations, visibility unintentionally became the end goal when it was actually meant to be a starting point. The foundation, I mean, when I say starting point, the idea of visibility was for it to serve as a foundation for better decisions and more reliable execution. So the challenge today is no longer a lack of visibility, but the difficulty of translating insight into timely and consistent execution. With that context, I will hand it over to Kumar, who will walk us through the core execution challenges that the organizations are facing today. Kumar, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Sanjeevi. So as you have correctly pointed out, most of the things in supply chain, like dashboards, alerts, and all. So if you say, like in most of supply chain fail, not because they lack insights, but because they cannot convert that insights into a coordinated action across systems and teams. So here is the agenda, where we will be discussing on explore, identify, examine, discuss, and evaluation. So over the past decade, I think Sanjeevi has taken care of these words like visibility and the alert and the inventory and the demand. So we have seen that key enterprises have invested heavily in visibility, algorithm-driven planning, constraint-based models, and end-to-end synchronized planning. Which I mean is, like, the system uses statistical model and optimization logic to generate synchronized decision across demand, supply, and inventory, rather than relying entirely on a manual judgment. And also, when I say end-to-end synchronized planning, where demand, inventory, distribution decisions are aligned and updated together as a single planning process, rather than being handled in isolated functional silos. Taken together, these capabilities represent a significant step forward in planning maturity. Enterprise now have better forecast, more synchronized plans, and far greater visibility into their operations than they did even 5 to 6 years ago. So in identify stage, we will discussing more about key as we speak, with CSCOs or supply chain leaders across industries. The question is shifting now from whether they have visibility to whether that visibility is actually improving execution outcomes. So what we consistently observe is a gap between insights and execution, where disruptions are detected early, but response still depend on manual coordination and fragmented decisions. And ultimately, the real measure of supply chain maturity is not how much the organization can see, but how reliably and how quickly it can act when condition changes. So moving on to the next slide, we'll see visibility answers the question, what's happening? Operational control answers the question, what are we doing about it right now? So let us look more closely at the nature of the challenges organizations are facing. So the first issue is that the insights often remain too vague for action. A dashboard may show a delay in supplier shipment, but it does not necessarily prescribe what should be done next. Should the order be split, expedited, or reassigned to another supplier? And that decision depends on human judgment. The second issue is inadequate automation in exception handling. Many systems are excellent at running the normal flow of operations, but when disruption occur, they fall back to normal manual process. Here, teams can start sending emails, making calls, or updating the spreadsheets. Third, we see fragmentation across systems. What I mean is planning platform, transportation systems, warehouse management, and order management often operate independently. And this create data silos and slows down coordinated responses. So finally, decision fatigue is becoming a real issue. So when every disruption generate multiple alerts, teams are forced to make hundreds of small decisions each day. And over the time, this leads to slower responses and inconsistent outcomes. And if I see, as I can refer to it, Sanjeevi also, that we are seeing the market perspective. This is exactly where buyer expectations are changing. Like the supply chain leaders are no longer satisfied with the tools that simply shows problem. They are looking for systems that can act on those problems in a controlled and predictable manner. By going on to the next slide, which is transitioning from visibility to operational control. So far, we have discussed the challenges around visibility and the kinds of execution breakdown that organizations are experiencing. This slide, a shift in the conversations from diagnosing the problem to defining the next stage of supply chain maturity. Like for many years, visibility was the central focus for transformation efforts, and the logic was simple. If organization could see disruption earlier, they would be able to respond more effectively. So as a result, company have invested in control towers, real-time tracking platforms, and analytics layer. So those investments were not misplaced. Most of the large enterprises today, we have seen that today have far better visibility into their supply chain operations than they did a decade ago. They can detect delays, monitor inventory positions, and track exception across multiple echelons of supply chains or multiple nodes of supply chain. However, uh, visibility improved. The operating model around it often remained the same, and the system became better at highlighting problem. But the response mechanism is still dependent on manual coordination. And this is where many organizations are reaching a plateau. They can see a disruption clearly, yet the outcome still depends on how quickly the teams can coordinate and execute. And here, if you see, the operational control represents the next logical gap. It is not about replacing visibility. It's about extending it into the execution layer. So in a control oriented environment, the system helps drive the response. Signals are interpreted through predefined logic, common disruption triggered standardized action, and execution becomes coordinated across systems rather than dependent on each individual teams of planning, execution, and analytics. So from a leadership perspective, this reflects a shift in priorities. The focus now moves from the reporting accuracy to decisions reliability. The question here is no longer to what just happened. It's about uh, how consistently the organization responds when conditions change. So with that transition in mind, let us now look more closely at where execution actually breaks down inside the supply chain. Moving on to the next slide. So at this stage of discussion, it becomes very important move from broad concepts into the day-to-day realities of supply chain operations. Most organizations today do not struggle with visibility in the, if you can say, in the traditional sense. They have dashboards, alerts, real-time tracking across network. The breakdown doesn't occur in detection, it occurs in execution. That's the whole point of having this webinar. When we analyze disruption events across industries, whether in manufacturing, retail, industrial distribution, we tend to see a consistent pattern. The first signal is usually detected on time. A shipment delay, a supplier constraint, or a demand spike is identified through the systems. But the organization become aware of the issue fairly quickly. Although the disruption is visible, the response path is rarely straightforward. So the next step involves interpretation. That team must determine the impact of the disruptions, and they must evaluate alternative options or building the scenarios. So whether that involves rerouting, reallocation, or scheduling adjustments. So this step often requires coordination across multiple functions in the ecosystems. So if I say planning teams assess supply and demand implication, logistic teams evaluate transportation options, customer service team consider the impact on commitments. So since each function operates with its own priority and system, decision making becomes fragmented. That Sanjeevi has talked in his intro paragraph. So the real breakdown typically occurs when the organization attempts to move from decision to execution. Even after a corrective action is agreed upon or implementing it across multiple systems, becomes a challenge. So a change in allocation may require updates in planning tools, warehouse systems, and order platforms, because they are all connected with each other on a single network. If these systems are not tightly integrated or not operable, execution slows down.
Right.
So yeah. And if you see, another issue is inconsistency across locations. Like one region may respond quickly, while another may take hours or days to implement the same action. So although the disruption is identical, but the outcomes vary depending on the local processes and coordination. So what we are observing, we as QKS Group, across the market is there is a shift in focus. So supply chain leaders are beginning to look beyond detection and visibility. They are examining where execution actually breaks down, and those gaps can be addressed. So this slide is meant to highlight that reality and the challenge. Like the challenge is no longer about seeing the disruption, or the challenge is about how organization responds once the disruption is visible. So going on to the next slide, we'll be having a discussion because in the previous slide we have discussed how execution breaks down. That tends to occur after disruption are detected, because the disruptions are visible that time. This slide takes an idea a step further by mapping where visibility actually ends and where execution begins to slow down. So like if I see, like most of the organization today are reasonably strong at the first stage, which is detection. Like the disruption are visible. Real-time alerts and dashboard highlights the disruption across the network, whether it is delayed shipment, a supplier constraint, or a sudden demand hike. The signal usually appears in the system quickly. However, the disruption is visible, the system often stops at that point because the alert is generated, but it still requires manual interpretation before any action is taken, because someone has to evaluate the signal, understand the context, and decide what organization do next. And this leads us to a second stage, which is decision making. So team identify the corrective action during its disruptions. So on paper, if you see, this seems straightforward, yet in practice, decisions depends on coordination across multiple functions, like what I have discussed before, like in planning teams, logistic teams, procurement, and customer service, all need to align and become a one network. Since these teams operate across different systems and priorities, the process takes time, and even relatively small disruption can require multiple conversation and approval before the decision is finalized. And that brings us to the third stage, is execution. Action such as rerouting shipments, reallocating inventory, or modifying customer orders are often handled manually. Like I said before, disconnected systems make it difficult to implement decision automatically. And a change in one system may not immediately reflect in another. So this is where the most significant delays occur, although the organization knows what needs to be done. It cannot execute the decision quickly and consistently. The final stage is recovery, because the execution varies across teams, location, response speed, uh, and several others. Like one region may resolve the issue quickly, while another may take much longer. So without a synchronized execution, recovery becomes inconsistent and unpredictable. So I will just take a pause here before we move forward. Let's get a quick sense of where everyone stands through a short poll. And so the poll is like, what percentage of disruption responses in our organization still rely on manual coordination across teams? Yes, I'm getting the responses. It's yeah, someone said 25 to 50%. Okay, 50 to 75%. Now let me continue as you go on with the poll. Let me go with the slides and publish the result afterwards so that each and everyone can see the cumulative results of what they have responded. So as we are, we'll be moving to the next slide. So at this point, this is important to take more balanced view of visibility platforms. The tools have delivered real progress across the supply chain landscape. So they have improved transparency, enabled faster detection of disruption, and provided leadership team with a clear picture of network performance. If we look at the advantages first, the visibility or the pros, the visibility platforms have significantly improved monitoring capabilities. Organization can now track shipments, order, and inventory across multiple nodes in real time, which is more complex 5 to 6 years ago. And this level of transparency was not possible in many supply chains. So another advantage is the ability to convert that raw data into insights. That visibility platforms aggregate signals from multiple sources and present them in a structured manner. This allows team to identify trends, buyer behavior, the risk, the potential disruption earlier than before. And if I talk about the scalability is also an important benefit. Like modern visibility platforms can extend across complex multi-region supply chain network. They bring data together from supplier, carrier, warehouse, and distribution center to a unified view. However, although these strengths are real, limitations begin to surface and when disruption occur. So the first limitation is manual coordination. The critical situation often require manual intervention because the system highlights the problem, though it does not always define the response. So team must interpret the signal, discuss the option, and coordinate across functions before action is taken. And the second limitation would be the delayed execution, where there is often a gap between detection and action, even when a decision is agreed upon, or implementing it across multiple systems takes time. And this delay can increase cost and affect customer commitments. So the third limitation is the system fragmentation. Many organizations operate nowadays or before also with multiple platforms that are not tightly integrated. And as the systems are various, like into the planning or the transportation, the warehouse, the tools often function independently. Since these systems are not fully synchronized, not coordinated execution becomes difficult. This is why many supply chain leaders are becoming or is a beginning to reassess their technological priorities. And the focus is gradually shifting from pure visibility to execution reliability. Now the question is no longer about how much of the network is visible. The real question is how effectively the organization can act on that visibility. With this, we'll be going to the next slide, which bring the discussion into a clearer framework by differentiating between awareness and control. Because in my perspective, awareness is what most supply chain visibility initiatives have focused on over the last decade. It is centered around monitoring data, tracking signals, and presenting that information through dashboards. That's why organization uses this tool to understand what is happening across suppliers, warehouse, and transportation networks. And this level of awareness is important. It provides a real-time view of supply chain flows and help them detect the disruption earlier than before. However, awareness alone does not guarantee effective response because it tells you what is happening, though it does not always determine what the system should do next. And control represents the next stage of maturity. It involves proactive decision making, like from the demand and the supply side. So it's give you the clear decision authority and consistent execution instead of simply reporting irregularities or control oriented system that translate insights into actions. So if we look at the comparison table on the slide, the awareness slide focus on monitoring and visibility. It provides a view of supply chain activity, although it often lack a direct mechanism for actions. So on the control side, the focus shifts to a proactive, and the proactive management means anticipating disruptions and acting on them before they affect service, cost, or operations. So in practical terms, this means that when a disruption occurs, the system does not stop at the alert stage. Instead, it translates that awareness to the operation action. Similarly, disruption trigger similar responses regardless of location or a team. So the key question is no longer how much network is visible. The question is how reliable the organization can detect that visibility. So this shift from awareness to control ultimately defines the operational maturity in modern supply chain. So Sanjeevi and Anish, that reminds me of one case study that we have recently worked upon. So that case study is about a global consumer electronic manufacturer that has heavily invested in visibility platforms. The company had real-time dashboards tracking supplier shipments, component availability, and factory output across Asia, Europe, and North America. From a visibility standpoint, the environment was quite mature. So during that component shortage, the system flagged the issue early. The control tower identified which production orders were at risk and which customer deliveries would be affected, so that the organization had full awareness of the disruption almost a week before it impacted the production. However, this because the response is still dependent on manual coordination, planning teams had to identify the alternative inventory across regions, and procurement team had to check with secondary suppliers. Now, logistics teams had to evaluate expedited shipments, and customer service team had to decide which orders should be prioritized. So these decisions were handled differently across regions. The outcome were inconsistent, and one plant recovered within 2 days by reallocating inventory, and another plant waited, or a warehouse waited for expedited shipments and lost nearly a week of production. Uh, Although the disruption was visible everywhere, the response varied significantly. After this experience, the company introduced a predefined response logic for similar shortages, and the system began reallocating available inventory automatically based on order priority and service commitments. So as a result, response time become more consistent, and the impact of similar disruption was reduced. So now going on to the next slide, this is the stage where this is useful to step away from high level concepts and look at how visibility actually functions in day-to-day supply chain operations. Because most of the organization today have some sort of real-time dashboards, control towers, event monitoring tools, but these systems generate alerts, highlight delays, and provide updates across the network. Although this level of transparency is valuable, but the daily operating reality tells a slightly different story. Because in most of the supply chain control rooms, teams spend a large portion of their day reacting to alerts. they monitor dashboards, they review exception reports, and track changes in shipments status or inventory levels across the nodes of the supply chain. The tool are effective at identifying issues, though they often stop at the point of notification. So once an alert appears, the next step depend on human coordination. The team must interpret that signal, assess the impact, and determine the appropriate response for that query. And this usually involves communication across planning, logistics, procurement, customer service functions, and other teams. So since each functions operate with its own priorities and system, decision making becomes fragmented. That's what we wanted to cover in this whole webinar. So even a small disruption may require multiple discussion before action is taken. So over the time, the reactive cycle becomes the default operating model. And the another issue that I also see in the market, that is a lack of actionable insights, because many visibility tools are designed to describe what has happened or what might happen. They provide descriptive or predictive information. However, they do not always recommend a course of action. And if you see, the technological integration also plays a significant role in day-to-day challenges, like all the platforms, different functions, although they exchange data, but they do not always share decision logic. So here, the stakeholder coordination adds another layer of complexity. Different teams owns different parts of the response. Since responsibilities are distributed across multiple approvals, this slows down the response time and creates variability in outcomes. So across industry, when we now see supply chain leaders paying closer attention to decision reliability, and the focus is shifting from simply detecting disruption to ensuring consistent response across them. So so when we step back and look at these day-to-day practices, the pattern becomes clear. Most organizations have reached a reasonable level of visibility, although their execution model still depends heavily on manual coordination and fragmented decision making. So the real opportunity now lies in moving beyond observation and towards consistent system driven action that require a different set of priorities, not just in technology, but also in leadership focus and operating models. And with that context, I will now hand over it to Sanjeevi, who will walk us through some of the practical, actionable insights for chief supply chain officers and supply chain leaders as they make these transitions towards operation control. So,
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Kumar. And so if we look at the discussion so far, the core message is that visibility alone does not change outcomes. The real shift for the chief supply chain officers and supply chain leaders is from monitoring performance to managing execution reliability across the network. So the first, we have identified 3 actionable steps. The first actionable step is to realign leadership focus. The first and foremost important thing. The supply chain leaders need to move beyond metrics such as forecast accuracy or dashboard coverage and begin measuring how consistently the organization responds to disruptions. Decision speed and recovery stability are actually becoming more relevant indicators of operational maturity today. So, after all, a perfect forecast does not help much if the response still depends on a late night email chain, right? So, and the second step is to ensure that technology investments are aligned with execution outcomes. Instead of adding more and more layers of visibility, organizations should actually prioritize those platforms that can translate signals into actions. This means linking planning and execution systems in real time and embedding decision logic into operational processes. Because knowing about a disruption 5 minutes earlier only matters if the system can do something about it. And the third step is to adopt a structured advisory approach. Targeted diagnostic workshops and scenario-based evaluations actually help identify where execution gaps exist and which disruptions should be automated first. Although every supply chain operates under different constraints, the objective remains the same. The goal is not perfect planning, but predictable, coordinated execution when disruptions occur. So moving to the next slide, where we are going to talk about embracing technology for better execution. So thank you, Anish. So as we move forward, operational control technology becomes as we move towards operational control, technology becomes the key enabler of consistent execution. However, the role of technology is also changing. In the past, most investments were focused on visibility, dashboards, and reporting accuracy. Although those capabilities were necessary, they do not by themselves improve operational outcomes. As many teams have discovered, and as we hear from a lot of customers that we speak to, a beautifully designed dashboard does not fix a delayed shipment. The next phase of supply chain technology is centered on execution logic. Systems must be able to translate signals into actions. This means real-time linkages between planning and execution environments, where a decision made in one layer immediately triggers actions across transportation, warehouse, or order systems. And supply chain leaders are also, interestingly, shifting their expectations from technology. The focus is moving from alert generation to outcome-driven decision support. So instead of asking how many disruptions were detected, leaders are beginning to ask how many disruptions were resolved automatically and how consistently those resolutions were executed. Because an alert that still requires 3 phone calls and 2 approvals is really not automation. It's just faster awareness. I'm connecting this to an old proverb that fits this transition well. A map is only useful if it helps you reach the destination. And visibility provides the map. Execution technology is what actually moves the organization forward. Having said that, I'm moving to the next slide, where as we reach the key takeaway of this discussion, it is useful to step back and look at a broader shift that is taking place across supply chain leadership. For many years, visibility was treated as the primary objective. Organizations invested in control towers, analytics platforms, and real-time tracking solutions. These investments were necessary, and in many cases, they delivered the intended transparency across the network. In some organizations, the supply chain became more visible than ever, just not always more controllable. However, although visibility improved, execution models often remained unchanged. Alerts were generated, insights were available, yet decisions still depended on manual coordination across teams. This created delays, inconsistent responses, and unpredictable recovery outcomes. So the signal was digital, but the response was still manual. Bridging the gap from visibility to operational control requires a completely different mindset. The focus must shift from simply observing disruptions to managing them in a coordinated and system-driven manner. From a technology perspective, this means platforms must translate signals into executable actions. Planning and execution layers must be connected in real time so that decisions can move across network without manual intervention. From a leadership perspective, the priority must move from reporting accuracy to decision reliability. Supply chain leaders and chief supply chain officers evaluate how consistently their organizations respond to disruptions, not just how accurately they forecast demand. In simple terms, visibility tells you what is happening, and operational control determines how effectively you respond. Now, I have a question for the CSOs, and I will complete this discussion with a closing remark with the final slide. And before we move to the final slide, I would like to leave you with a question that many CSOs are beginning to ask themselves. If disruption doubles tomorrow, would you respond as supply as a chief supply chain officer by design or by escalation? This question is not about technology alone. It is about operating models, decision authority, and execution consistency across the organization. In many supply chains today, responses still happen through escalation. An alert appears, teams begin coordinating between themselves, approvals are requested, and actions are taken step by step. And sometimes the disruption actually moves much faster than the approval process. Although this approach may work in isolated situations, it becomes very difficult to sustain when disruptions increase in frequency and scale. Responding by design is different. It means the organization has predefined response logic, systems are connected, decision authority is embedded into the processes. Similar disruptions trigger similar actions regardless of region or team. This is the essence of operational control. It is not about eliminating disruptions, but about ensuring that responses are predictable, accurate, coordinated, and timely. So with that, I will pass this on to Anish for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Kumar and Anand, for taking us through the insights for the supply chain leaders. And I'm sure our viewers were pretty excited to listen to both of you. And we do have, just seeing that we do have attendees from, let's say, some I can see some from Brazil, some from Spain. So we have people from spread across the world. And once again, thank you all for joining us. And like I mentioned before, you can feel free to drop your Q questions in the Q&A section below. And if not today, we'll definitely revert back to all your questions via mail. And to Sanjeevi and Anand, we do have a couple of questions to both of you. So our viewers want to know, how can we move forward operational control without replacing our existing planning and execution systems? Who wants to take this up?
I'll take that.
Sure.
As I have covered most of the part, and that is a very common concern. And in most of the cases, the organization do not need to replace their core system to move operational control, because the shift is less about system replacement and more about system orchestration, which includes the three parameter, which is coordination, collaboration, and visibility. So most of the enterprises already have strong planning system, transportation platforms, and warehouse solution in place. Now the real gap is usually exists between those systems. They operate independently, although they are expected to deliver a coordinated response. So sometimes the operational control is typically achieved by introducing an execution layer or an orchestration capability that connects this system in real time. And this layer interprets disruption signals or applies predefined decision logic and trigger that action across the relevant platform. So, Anish, the focus should be on integration, workflow automation, and scenario-based decision rules rather than large-scale system replacement. So, in our experience, organization that take this incremental integration-led approach tend to see faster and more practical result. I hope that answers.
Thanks for answering that, Kumar. Sanjeev, you want to add anything to that, or we
I'm,
have a
I'm,
couple
I'm,
of
I'm
questions?
good with Kumar's response. He opted to answer that, didn't give me a chance, so I will.
We do have more questions to both of you. I mean, I'll just move on to the next question.
Sure.
So, what type of disruptions should organization automate first?
Okay, so I think some of these questions are linked towards each other. So the best starting point is not the most complex disruption, but the most frequent and predictable one. So every supply chain has a set of recurring issues like shipment delays, minor supplier shortages, inventory imbalance between locations, regions, or echelons, or last mile delivery adjustments are very common examples. So although each one of these disruption may seem small, but they occur frequently and consume a significant amount of operational effort. So these frequency from low to medium complexity disruption are ideal candidates for automation. The organization already understands the typical response, and the decision logic can be defined in advance. So once these scenarios are automated, teams experience immediate relief from routine coordination tasks. That creates both operational benefit and internal confidence in the automation approach. So after that, the organization can gradually move towards more complex, high impact scenarios, what if scenarios. So, but it is usually more effective to start with the disruption that occur every day, which is a frequent recurring issues, Anish.
Well, thanks again, Kumar, for answering that. I believe, Paul, you got your answer on the question that you had raised. With that, I'll just move on to the next question. So, again, our viewer want to know how do we balance automation with human oversight, especially in critical decisions?
Thank you, Anish. I mean, Kumar, let me take the next few questions, and thanks in advance. Okay, and Anish, that's a very important question, and the one that we hear very often from our end users. See, when we talk about operational control, it does not really mean removing humans from the process. What it actually means is using automation where it is needed the most, where it adds value, and preserving human judgment where it matters most. And these routine, repetitive disruptions are the strong candidates for automation. These are scenarios where the response is already well understood, and the organization would take the same action most of the time. So automating these cases helps the organization reduce coordination delays and frees up teams to focus more on strategic decisions. See, if every minor delay still needs a meeting, automation then has not really helped.
Yeah.
But high impact or unusual disruptions should absolutely involve human oversight. Say strategic supplier failures, major demand shocks, or even geopolitical events require broader context and judgment that systems alone would not be able to provide. So we will need human oversight in such cases. A practical approach, I would say, is to define thresholds. And below a certain impact level, the system can act automatically. And above that threshold, the system escalates the decision to human teams. So this hybrid model ensures that automation improves one, speed, two, consistency, while also ensuring that human expertise remains firmly in place for the decisions that truly shape business outcomes. I hope I answered the question. It was a very interesting question. Thank you.
Well put across, Sanjeevi, and thanks for answering that. I'll just take one last question, not to take up much of your time today.
Kumar, I would answer that question.
So the last and final question for today's session, and to all those unanswered questions that we have in the queue, we'll surely revert back to those via mail and with our on-demand version of our entire webinar. So if you want to go through that again, feel free to go through that. With that, again, I'll come back to our last question. So what metrics should supply chain officers use to measure operational control or execution reliability?
That's a great question, because what we measure often shapes how we operate, right? I mean, what's measured can be improved. That's what we usually say. And traditionally, supply chains have been measured using metrics such as forecast accuracy is one, inventory turns, or transportation cost per unit. These metrics, I would say, are still important, but they don't fully capture the execution capability, especially when the conditions change. So to measure operational control, the supply chain leaders and chief supply chain officers should begin tracking more decision-oriented metrics. I mean, that's what they need to start tracking rather than the traditional metrics. So one example I can think of is disruption response time. How long does it take from the moment a disruption is detected to the moment corrective action is actually executed, not just discussed? And another important metric would be response consistency. When similar disruptions occur across different regions or facilities, do they lead to similar outcomes, or do results vary widely depending on who is on shift or what team is involved? If every site solves the same problem differently, that's flexibility, but it's not always control. It does not control at all unless it is standardized. And automation coverage, I would say, is also a very, very useful indicator. What percentage of disruptions are handled automatically and what percentage of disruptions are handled manually? This would help the leaders understand whether technology is truly supporting execution or just providing more visibility. So together, these metrics provide a clear, a transparent picture of execution maturity, and this shows how the organization behaves under real operating conditions, not just how accurately it plans under the ideal scenarios. I mean, I hope I answered that question.
Well put across, Sanjeevi, and thanks for sharing a light on the metrics that to be monitored during, especially for CSCOs in the future or in the current scenarios. So once again, thank you, Sanjeevi and Kumar, for an insightful session today. And if there is one central idea from today's session, I believe it is that visibility alone does not improve outcomes. Most organizations have already reached a reasonable level of transparency across their supply chain. Now, the real differentiator now is how consistently and how quickly those organizations respond when disruptions occur. The shift from awareness to operational control is not just a technology decision. It is also about decision authority, system integration, and leadership priorities. And to all those supply chain officers that we have on our session today, which is nothing but increasingly being measured on how accurately they plan, but how reliably they execute when executions or conditions change. Again, we encourage all our viewers and to all those who missed today's session to reflect upon our operating environment. When disruption occurred, does your organization respond through a predefined system or a system-driven process, or does it still happen, or does it still depend on manual coordination and escalation? With that, we'll be also sharing a detailed blog on the webinar that or the session that we had discussed today. That is, when visibility isn't enough, what supply chain leaders or supply chain officers challenge of control or operational control, where we'll be expanding the key ideas that we discussed today and the key insights that we have found out on today's session. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and do follow us on LinkedIn and do to stay updated with all the upcoming webinars that we have planned for all of you. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to drop in a mail to infoleads@qksgroup.com. And with that, thank you all for joining us. It was a wonderful session to both Sanjeevi and Anand.
Thank you, Anish.
Thank you, Anish, and thanks everyone for joining. So looking forward to answer more questions if you have, by email, of course. Thank you.